All right, welcome to another edition here of a new thing that we're doing here. We're going to pick an off topic and just a random topic and discuss it. And this topic was brought up by none other than one of our guests here, Mr. Thom Jennings. And then we also have Mr. David Hens here. Welcome.
Yay for me and for David.
And boo for me.
Oh, Joe, you're going to somehow figure out a way to be different than the two of us. Cause I feel like Dave and I have built a reputation of ganging up on you. You know what I mean?
All right, Thom, why don't you explain to them what we're going to discuss today?
So in especially, in classic rock, the types of music that we typically review on these shows may not be classic rock, could be heavy metal, could be metal. Every artist seems to have like that album, a big one. In outside of the rock genre, for example, Thriller is, Michael Jackson's biggest record. You think in classic rock, something like Peter Frampton's Frampton Comes Alive. And once you've had this one big record, the pressure's on. Now you have to follow it up with something and capitalize on the success of that record. So we each were tasked with picking 5 records that were huge and the records that followed them. And we're going to say whether it was a successful follow-up or if it was a missed opportunity for the band to really capitalize on a great record.
Perfect. All right. So let's get started, dig right in. Dave, what do you got for the first album that you like to throw out and discuss?
My first one is U2's Achtung Baby from 1991. Obviously, it followed 1987's The Joshua Tree, which sold 10 million records. And then with obviously the side one of that album is classic with Where the Streets Have No Name. I still haven't found what I'm looking for, With or Without You, Bullet the Blue Sky. And it's just a massive album. And they took 4 years to make Achtung Baby. And Achtung Baby, it sold 8 million. So, it wasn't much of a drop off, but you could see a stylistic change coming for the band. They focused more on electronics and kind of at the Edge was using a lot of different things to manipulate his guitar tone with loopers and all that stuff. And they were still a massive band, but it was the shift was definitely coming and would kind of like foreshadow what would come later in the 90s when they made Pop and Zooropa in like 93, 97. So, but with Achtung Baby, I think it's success still. Even better than The Real Thing is great. One was a massive song. Mysterious Ways, The Fly, Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses. I think critically, if you look at like Rolling Stone magazine, or not that I value their opinion all that highly, but at the time they considered it one of the best albums of the decade. So, and I think it's like the 32 years on, it's still ranked pretty highly within their catalog. So, what do you guys think about it?
That's a great choice. I didn't even think about that one. That is excellent. It's fascinating because I think U2 was savvy enough to let the success kind of sink in from the Joshua Tree. Like they left enough distance between that and their follow-up to maybe build some anticipation, and that could backfire. And then the other choice that they had was, do we stick with the same formula or do we try to reinvent ourselves? And they reinvented themselves. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I heard Achtung Baby, I hated it because it was such a departure. But after a while, I listened to it, I really began to appreciate it. And it's such a different record from the other one that, and you're right, it was a success. They had some radio hits with it, but again, they kind of solidified their reputation as a mega star, the big artist.
Yeah, well, I think they also did other projects, and they did that Rattle and Hum, right, what that actually was released in between both of them. So they did a bunch of other things in that time frame. I got to remember the album came out in 87 initially, and then this one, Achtung Baby, came out in 91. So you probably were on the road for like 2.5 years touring for the Joshua Tree. You found time to get that documentary Rattle and Hum out there. So, there was a lot of time frame, and like you said, the way the music industry was shifting. I feel that that's a great this is a great follow up right here. I mean, you can't go wrong with it.
Yeah, and Rattle and Hum. I mean, that's a tricky one. I think even if you're doing a ranking for U2, it's like, do you include that one because it's kind of a compilation, kind of a live album. It has some new material on it, but it's not a traditional studio album. So,
Right.
in terms of time between studio albums, they definitely. I mean, Rattle and Hum to me was just a kind of mid career way to capitalize on a pretty deep catalog at that point.
Yeah, it would definitely not be counted in our ranking for sure.
Yeah.
When we get to U2 somewhere down the line here.
Yeah, I say that because I just looked at a U2 ranking not too long ago. Like I think it was maybe even this morning, and it was included. And I thought, wow, that's weird. Why would they put that one in? But anyhow, that leaves me. I'm up.
Yeah.
So here's one that I mean is universally considered the band's biggest album. That's AC/DC's Back in Black. That's the big one, and it was a follow up to Highway to Hell, which could have potentially been a bigger album, but of course Bon Scott passed away, and Back in Black becomes this just huge thing, and very quickly they wound up cranking out For Those About to Rock, and my opinion on For Those About to Rock is, I mean, on some level, you could almost take Back in Black and For Those About to Rock and make it a double record. I mean, they're very similar in terms of style. They were working with Mutt Lange again, so it had that real Mutt Lange sound. And later on, I think with AC/DC too, later on in their catalog, one of the subtle changes that just made a huge difference on their sound was changing drummers. And this was when Rudd was still with them. And Rudd was a very important part of that AC/DC sound. I think in terms of quality, considering that they put out this album, I believe it was maybe a year or two afterwards, but definitely less than 2 years. It was a success. It didn't sell nearly as many as Back in Black. So in terms of the commercial portion of it, probably not considered a success by the record label. But in terms of like an album, in terms of it being a really good follow-up to a solid album, I thought they did a great job.
Yeah. I think this album gets lost in a way in a shuffle because it wasn't as successful, as Back in Black, unfortunately. It only went, it went 4 times platinum. So it's definitely, but now you got to look at Back in Black, it's at 25 times platinum. So if you look at it from that perspective, but the fact that it still went, 4 times platinum is still pretty impressive in itself, because AC/DC, since For Those About to Rock was released, they've only sold one album after that has sold more than it, which is The Razor's Edge.
Yeah.
So yeah, it doesn't really I mean, that's an impressive feat. A lot of was going on in the early 80s. So you got to remember they were pretty much rushed in to make this album. Let's be honest here. Back in Black came out in July of 80. And here we are, November 1981, a short 15 months later, you're coming out with your next album already. And that Back in Black, they were touring for it heavily. And I don't even know how they found time to write this album For Those About to Rock in that short period of time. That's why they probably took off a little bit more time before they came up with the follow-up to For Those About to Rock with Flick of the Switch in 83. They took about almost 2 years between albums there. So, but I feel, this album, For Those About to Rock, is kind of gets a bad rap, and it really shouldn't. I think the problem with the record is it didn't have as many songs that got on the radio, and the songs that did make it on there just didn't really last long, like Evil Walks and the title cut is everywhere still. That's going to remain one of their biggest songs. Let's Get It Up was another big one, but it just didn't do probably what they were hoping for. So since those 2 songs didn't really get as much airplay as some of the songs on Back in Black, it just kind of fizzled out, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, it's a long shadow to be in, but I mean, I think even though For Those About to Rock wasn't as radio friendly in terms of an album, it's a very strong record. I mean, not as strong as Back in Black, let's be honest, but you know, it certainly wasn't a dud by comparison.
What do you got for it, Dave? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think it's a strong record. Inject the Venom was always my favorite song off the album. I think that's a deep cut you don't hear enough of anymore. But yeah, I mean, with Back in Black especially, I mean, that Mutt Lange kind of like defined the guitar sound for the 80s on that record, just the way the production made the guitar sound. So I mean, it was going to be really difficult to follow up and kind of replicate that. But I think given how the kind of pressure they were under, I think they succeeded fairly well. So.
Okay, so that takes care of Tom. So I'm going to throw one out here. We're going to go with the Jay Giles Band, the follow-up to Freeze Frame. And this is one of those situations where probably their biggest album to date, Freeze Frame, turned out to be a bad thing for them because because at that point, Freeze Frame was their only in lone album to go platinum, but and it reached #1. But there was so much creative tension in between the band, between Seth Justman and Peter Wolf, and the direction the band was heading in. Wolf was not happy with it. He was more of a R&B guy, kind of like a soul type. He was more interested in that side of the music. He wasn't really interested in the pop side of it. And the follow-up to Freeze Frame, you're getting even, well, I'm getting odds. Got to probably be, even with Wolf not in there, with it just was a disaster from the get-go. Let's be honest. If you ever heard that album, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's just, what a sad way for a great band to go out. They never made another album after that. So I gave you a dud here. What's your take on it, Dave?
I don't think I've ever actually sat down and listened to that whole album all the way through. So I remember a couple songs. I think like Californicating, I think was on there, which is obviously, it's just a lot of it just felt silly to me. But I mean, my favorite record of theirs anyway has always been the Full House live album. So I mean, even Freeze Frame, while it's radio friendly and I like it, it was never one that I gravitated to that often. But they're definitely one of those bands that's kind of never gotten their as much credit as they should. So
yeah, definitely they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame regardless of maybe this album you're getting even while I'm getting out is what's keeping them out of there. I don't know. So Tom, let's hear from the wizard here. What do you got here for this album?
I've never heard it. I don't know. I know Freeze Frame actually very well. And it's man, I picked up a vinyl copy of it, I want to say about a year ago, to play at a vinyl night that I was working at, and was so impressed with that record. So much better than I remember. But I'll tell you a couple things. It coincidentally today is Peter Wolf's birthday, by the way. The only reason I know that is because I always check the birthdays when I do my Turntable Tuesdays and try to look for a connection. So happy birthday, Peter Wolf, wherever you are. And his solo albums are absolutely incredible. But I've always found the funniest thing about Jay Giles is, and it is kind of a shame that they weren't able to capitalize on the success. And really, this was, to me, Freeze Frame is one of those records that kind of, I mean, they've been around for a long time. They just never quite had that record. Then they finally got it, and then we know the story after that. But I just think it's hilarious that they, in a tragic way, that they were able to continue on as a Jay Giles band without Jay Giles in the band. Literally the only guy who didn't perform with them, Mm-hmm. Like I get the fact that Marshall Tucker band didn't have Marshall Tucker with them because, he was never in the band, but Jay Giles band, I mean, it was his band. I don't know. If I was Jay Giles, I would be one bitter dude. You know what I mean? Can you imagine going to a show, Jay Giles band, and you're like, I'm Jay Giles. Damn it. Oh, well, that's all I got. But great choice, by the way, Joey.
Well, another thing and we'll end it on this real quick. Interesting enough, we saw one of the last shows. The band probably will never perform under that moniker ever again. Back in 2015 at our park, we got to see one of their within their last 10 shows they ever performed as the Jay Giles band. And I'll tell you, if you remember that show, that was a pretty dang good show.
Peter Wolf's an amazing singer, amazing performer. I mean, you know, he's kind of Jagger-esque in his stage presence. He's a lot of fun. But I tell you, you got to check out those solo albums. Some of them have these Americana blues influences, very artsy, but just excellent. In terms of commercial viability, not a bit. But in terms of just great records that if you've never heard them, you should check them out. I strongly recommend them.
Yeah, I got all of them on CD, so I'm
Yeah.
all. I
Well, you
agree
know,
with
I
you.
mean, they're just
Yeah.
they're really beautiful, just beautifully done records. So it's and it's weird. You know, again, you think of like a guy like Alice Cooper. You know, Alice Cooper was the name of the band, but then he was able to take that persona and capitalize with it. Unfortunately, you know, Peter Wolf, I think a lot of people thought he was Jay Giles, so that when he tried to go out as Peter Wolf, there was that, I guess the term would be brand confusion. You know, they didn't associate him as the voice of Jay Giles because they thought Jay Giles was the voice of Jay Giles. Is there another band that was in a similar situation that maybe was named after somebody other than the singer?
Van Halen.
Well, Van Halen, yeah, I guess. But it wasn't the Eddie Van Halen band. I mean, it was just called Van Halen. So
yeah. No, there's a lot out, probably a few out there. That'd be another episode in itself, maybe.
Sure.
All right, Dave, you're throwing out your second one here.
All right, my second one is Meatloaf's Dead Ringer from 1981. Obviously, he puts out Bad Out of Hell. It's one of the biggest albums of all time. You know, it's 14 times platinum. The hits are all over the place. I mean, I feel like it was a perfect convergence of just his singing, the Todd Rundgren's production. Jim Steinman just wrote these bombastic songs that fit Meatloaf's singing style perfectly well. But then he waits 4 years to put out an album, and it doesn't really do anything. So I mean, it didn't even certify. I mean, he's got a duet with Cher on here, which is, I mean, it's okay, but there's really nothing on here that has held up over the years, I don't think. So I mean, and he from everything that he released after Dead Ringer in 1981 until 1993, when he revisited the Bad Out of Hell concept again for the second record, that Bad Out of Hell 2 went 5 times platinum. So pretty much nobody cared about anything Meatloaf did until he went back to what made him famous to begin with. So I mean, I think it's an okay listen from time to time, but I think overall, just he failed to kind of like strike while the iron was hot with Bad Out of Hell initially, and too much time had gone by. And I feel like Jim Steinman, maybe he wasted, or he poured so much into that first album that he used up his best material, and he just had no ideas left over for this one. So it's kind of a dud for me. So.
Okay, Tom.
Well, I'm going to piggyback because that was actually on my list. So we'll
was?
consider that my
Wow.
number 2. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I want everyone to note that David is the first one that said the name Todd Rundgren in this episode. Okay. Not me.
But you're the second. Okay.
But yes, I picked this one as well because again, Bad Out of Hell is just such a huge selling and iconic record. And there's so much to unpack when it comes to this particular record. And I agree with everything you said, David. And another thing of note, but one thing I will disagree with is that you said that Jim Steinman had used up all of his good material for Bad Out of Hell. And that's not the case. Meatloaf rejected a lot of songs that were hits for other people during this period of time. And there was always a lot of resentment between Steinman and Meatloaf. And actually Steinman recorded the follow-up to Bad Out of Hell. It's called Bad for Good. And Jim Steinman sings all the vocals on it. It's the same, Todd Rundgren produces it. If you ever get a chance to listen to it, it's a fascinating historical piece. Certainly better than Dead Ringer. But I think that Meatloaf on this record just was like a parody of himself, and what's funny is that Todd had always said he always thought that Bad Out of Hell was a Bruce Springsteen parody. And Dead Ringer almost seems like a parody of a parody. He's so overblown. and his vocal performance on Dead Ringer is borderline awful. I mean, he has some later records that are literally unlistenable, because his voice has just been so shredded. But he struggled. He struggled with his vocals because he I'm assuming he was never trained how to protect his voice. But I said heavy drug use, and then of course he had laryngitis, so he couldn't record the formal follow up to Bat Out of Hell. So by the time Dead Ringer comes around, and I also think the world had kind of moved on at that point. Now, all that criticism being said, let's acknowledge, like David said, Bat Out of Hell 2 comes. He goes back to the mothership, so to speak, and basically his career comes back from the dead. So you have to give Meatloaf a lot of respect for finally being able and willing to do that. And of course, it paid huge dividends. And if he hadn't done that, he would have just been a guy that had one great record and was never able to do anything of significance afterwards.
All right, well, I'll be the first to admit I'm not really much of a Meatloaf fan, so I'm not too familiar with all of his catalog after Bat Out of Hell. So this one definitely, I'm not even familiar with this Dead Ringer album, to tell you the truth. I looked at it to see if there's any songs on here I recognize, and there was one song that looked like it charted like in the 80s off of it. So yeah, I'm just not really a Meatloaf kind of guy. More of a mashed potatoes and steak, I guess. But yeah, I'm not really a Meatloaf fan. Yeah, it's the one album was okay in my opinion. I know it sold massively, but everybody has their own tastes, and mine just isn't Meatloaf. Did get to see him once though. He played the Seneca Allegheny Casino, and oddly enough, they wouldn't allow us to review it. They let us shoot it. We could take photos, but they wouldn't allow us to review it. We got to the point of getting back home. We get an email from the marketing manager saying, hold the reviews. And then Monday we got the official email saying, we're not running any reviews. Don't post any. If you want, you can post the photos. That's fine. But that was all we were allowed to do. That's the only time I've ever not been able to post a review for a show. It was really odd. I guess he was having vocal problems.
Yeah, there was a documentary that from around that time, and he was super paranoid about things, and he got criticized. I guess at one point they were doing Paradise by the Dashboard Light with a really young female dancer, and so the one reviewer wrote that it looked creepy, like an old man with a young girl, and he wore a wig. I don't know if he did that at the show you saw, but yeah, he was he was a complex figure. He really was. But I don't know, man. I've never been asked not to run a review, and on some level, I don't see how you even could be legally within your right to do that. You know what I mean? Like it's press. You're at the show. You are covering it. I will say that I've had people asked to read my review before I submit it, but as a professional courtesy, I would do that with a publicist that I've worked with, but it doesn't feel good. I mean, how are people supposed to, and David, I'm sure Joey, you agree with me. It's not like we're New York Times guys that are really going to trash an artist. I don't think I've ever trashed anybody. But still, how do you believe in the validity of reviews if you don't have the freedom to at least be somewhat objective?
Honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But well, rest in peace, Meat.
All right, so I'm throwing out my album here, and this album is the follow up to an album that was 4 times platinum, released in 1979. And its follow-up took 3 years later to come out, and that would be Famous Last Words by Supertramp.
Ooh.
Reached gold status. Yeah, top 10 album. Reached, in the UK it was 6, and in the US it was 5. So it reached top 5, or, in US even, surprisingly. But for some reason, it just You know, with the exception of one or two songs on the album, it never really got much airplay. I think It's Raining Again was the big hit on the song, and he played that, Roger did, when he came with the Art Park a few years back, which was a phenomenal show. He did a great job there. But you know, Super Breakfast in America, that was just a phenomenal album. And you know, at that point, you know, that the title came about because him and Rick Davies knew that the band was nearing its end. They could see the writing on the wall because of all the disagreements and everything. And it was a pretty apt title. Their famous last words. Vinyl Supertramp album with Roger Hodgson on the vocals and keyboards. What's your take on that, Dave? You familiar with the album at all?
I honestly, I don't think I've ever heard that album. I mean, I like Supertramp a lot. Like Crime of the Century has always been one of my favorite 70s albums. But I famously, I think After Breakfast America, I kind of just, I never really went any further. So.
Okay. What's your take, Tom?
I'm with Dave. I mean, Paris is one of my favorite live records. It's such a strong record. I mean, I know It's Raining Again. I'm sure I've heard Famous Last Words from beginning to end at some point because I'm a Supertramp fan. I literally own everything else on vinyl from the Hodgson era except for that record. And there must be a reason. So I must not have been overly impressed with it. But yeah, it's a great choice. I think we had kind of kicked that around when we were originally talking about doing the show, but I mean, Breakfast in America, it's just one of those, again, it's one of those records that's really, really special. You know, not a bad millisecond on it. But yeah, I mean, clearly there were some creative tensions between the two primary guys, and they couldn't get past that. And I'm sure they're all doing fine financially, just living off the royalties of the early catalog. But man, what a missed opportunity. But yeah, I'm glad we got to see Roger Hodgson perform because man, he was great. And he really was the voice behind most of the major hits, but certainly you would have loved to see it with Rick Davies was the other guy, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. You would have loved to see the Rick Davies material included as well. You almost wish he did like a Dennis DeYoung thing where he had another singer sing some of the Rick Davies material, but clearly they were not getting along for, whatever reason. And what a shame, because man, that live album, Paris, I mean, that's a band that's on my list that I really, really, really wish I'd seen live, because as a unit, they really played some great music. And it just wasn't the same when Hodgson left. Supertramp, definitely their music wasn't as good. And even Hodgson's solo work, which was great, it was very different from Supertramp. So it was kind of a loss for the fans.
All right, well, let's go to our third album there. What do you got for that one, Dave? What are you going to throw out to surprise us here?
Man, my third one is Nirvana's In Utero from 1993. Obviously follows up Nevermind from 91, which went 10 times platinum. It was a massive record, pretty much changed the industry as we knew it for a few years there. And everybody was trying to ape that sound for years to come. But I think the success of that record, just the weight of the expectations obviously contributed to Kurt Cobain's depression and substance issues, and just he kind of resented how big Nirvana had gotten at this point. So, and when you listen to In Utero, it's like a completely stripped down, more abrasive production value. I think he was trying to distance himself from the commercialism of Nevermind a little bit and trying to go in an opposite way. I mean, I think it's a great record. I mean, if you I'm not a huge Nirvana fan, but I definitely respect the songwriting. I think he had a way of connecting with people, and just his ability to, reach the hearts and minds of a generation of people who were feeling like they needed that kind of voice at that time in their life. I mean, I think All Apologies and Heart-Shaped Box were obviously the two big songs off this album. And then, I mean, the only record they made after this was the Unplugged record from MTV, which is also great, but it's also, I mean, I think the way they presented themselves in that, it was kind of and it almost makes you wonder what they would have sounded like had they made another record after this, because I don't think anything they would have come up with, it would have been very different from Nevermind. I think that was just like a one-off thing, and I don't think it was ever going to be duplicated. I mean, because even the album they made before Nevermind, Bleach from '89, it only sold 40,000 albums until Nevermind came out. And then it went up after that. But even the production on that, it's very stark. It was made on Sub Pop. It was still an up-and-coming label at that point. So it was an indie. But then, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if you guys have listened to In Utero all the way through in a while or if ever, but I mean, it was the emotion with which Kurt sang, it always kind of resonated with me, even if I didn't love every song he wrote. I think it was just what he what he symbolized for that decade, and at the time it was just, I mean, he was only around in the limelight for maybe 5 years, but the impact is, it's undeniable. So
Hey, Tom.
Yeah, I've never listened to a Nirvana record. I'm just not a
Never?
fan. No.
Wow.
No. No, I remember when that Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, and I was just like, what is this noise? I mean, I don't know. Some of the stuff is listenable to me. It's a generational thing. I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest of the three of us, but remember, I mean, I grew up on listening to like the Grateful Dead and Styx and things like that. Todd Rundgren. I just never had a taste for Nirvana in any way, shape, or form. I didn't feel the angst because I wasn't maybe of the right generation or the right age. And I don't know. I've maybe the same way you think Meatloaf. See, Meatloaf to me, I think that's a great record. I probably the same thing like with Nirvana. Like, yeah, I get it. It's a very popular record, but it's definitely not one I would ever own. Any Nirvana record, by the way. I mean, if you gave it to me, I wouldn't accept it.
Wow. All right. Well, my take
No
is
offense, David. I
a
mean,
little different. I remember when this album came out, there was a lot of people in the music industry praising it. Really, McCartney was one of them, believe it or not. He was raving about the album and how great the songwriting was. A lot of stuff. I remember reading up on that. Um, I'd say it's a good follow-up, just not a great follow-up. It does have, like David mentioned, a couple really good songs on here. The ones that got the airplay, All Apologies is another big song on this album. Penny Royalty was cool. But yeah, in comparison, it just doesn't match with the predecessor in this opinion. So good follow-up, but needed to be better but it still sold very, very well, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
but overall solid album. Better than Getting Even and Getting Odd, that's for sure. Definitely.
Well, it
All
sounds
right.
like pretty much anything is better than that. So
Pretty much. All right. So now it's Tom's turn to throw one out there.
we're gonna go with the boys from Illinois, the REO Speedwagon, and they were kind of building up to this big record, and they achieved their most success with High Infidelity, which is just a great album. I think that it probably shifted to a little bit poppier direction than some of the fans of their older music were necessarily comfortable with, but still a classic record. People of a certain age, really, this record resonated with them. They just loved it. And they went into the studio and came up. I mean, from everything I read, Kevin Cronin felt a lot of pressure to write material for a follow-up, and the follow-up's Good Trouble. And Joey and I have talked about Good Trouble many times over the years. I'm not sure why, because you're a big fan of this record, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think it's a good album.
And I'm not, I threw it on recently and I listened to it and I says, man, this is a good record, but you could definitely tell that it was an album that was rushed. Like they didn't really have the stockpile of material that they needed to do a proper follow-up. and they may have just been better off waiting, a couple, 3 years. And I think to some degree, this may have marked the beginning of the end of the relationship between Cronin and Richrath. But I don't know. It's, I mean, the only hit that was off this record was Keep the Fire Burning. The band doesn't really play any of the songs in concert now. I will say that I saw them on the tour for this record, and they played a healthy chunk of the material, and it really didn't do all that great live. I mean, it wasn't, but again, at that point, they had amassed the pre-Infidelity material. There wasn't a lot of space to put in songs from a new record because it meant that other stuff was going to be pushed out. So, for example, No 157 Riverside Avenue, which was a song that they had become well known for up to that point. So that was a bit of a disappointment on that particular tour. But success or failure, it did okay commercially. In fact, I think this is their highest charting album, if I remember correctly, and ironically enough. But I just don't think it was. I mean, it's definitely not in the top 4 or 5 of their releases. So in that respect, it's probably a bit of a failure.
Yeah, I mean, it's their 5th best-selling album, went platinum, so you can't go wrong there. Of course, you did have a diamond album before it. Good Trouble reached number 7, which was their 2nd highest. It tied with this Wheels Are Turning. So High Infidelity did reach number 1, so that's their highest, their highest charting one, like we mentioned there. So yeah, just like you said, we've talked about this one before, and anybody that wants to hear more in depth about it, go to our video page there and check out our ranking of the REO Speedwagon albums that we did, which was a very fun episode. Very, very fun. I really enjoyed that one.
Subscribe and share.
We'll talk all REO all day on that one. That was one of our first ones we did. It was really a good time.
Yeah.
But let's hear what Dave has to say. I like to hear what somebody younger has to see, looking at it from his perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a solid album. I mean, it's not. I don't think I would rank it in the top of the catalog, like maybe the top 4 or 5, but it's kind of middle of the pack for me. I mean, I know they did a lot of work at Sound City Studio back then. That you can definitely tell it has that Sound City production with the console that they had at that studio. That had a very distinct sound to it. But yeah, it's a solid album.
All right. So then let's see. Tom threw that one out. So I'm going to throw out the follow-up to the massive 1987 Whitesnake album. That would be none other than Slip of the Tongue, which came out in 1989 there. You got to remember, how big this Whitesnake album was. It really that's the album that broke for Coverdale here in America. And what a great album that Whitesnake album is. But Slip of the Tongue is the follow-up, and it doesn't quite measure up, in my estimation, to that album. But at the same time, it's a solid album. It has a very, very solid lineup. Adrian Vandenberg, guitarist, was supposed to be on the album, and he wrote all the tracks along with Coverdale. But the problem is he had injured his hand, and so he was unable to play on the album, which sucked. So they had to bring in somebody, and at that point, also Mr. Campbell was no longer in the band, Vivian Campbell. So they had to go out and get somebody, and they ended up bringing in the former guitarist from David Lee Roth's solo band, Mr. Steve Vai. And depending on your take on it, a lot of people feel that Vai didn't deliver like they had hoped. Overall, I thought it was a solid album. It just wasn't a great album. So, my take on that is I thought Vai did a commendable job, considering he had to come in here and, play on everything and figure it all out after, it was already all written and everything. But yeah, I'd say it's a solid follow-up, but yeah, it could have definitely been better, especially if Adrian Vandenberg was able to play on the whole album. Who knows what we would have gotten here? What are your guys thinking on this one?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of Steve Vai being in Whitesnake sounded better, but in their heads than it really worked out on the album. But I mean this the '87 album is just a monster. I mean, John Sykes' guitar tone on that is just ridiculous. So, I mean, for me, it was when he left the band, that was, I mean, they were never able to quite recapture that same height. I mean, I think the only song off Slip of the Tongue that really, like, I still listen to it from time to time is the Fool for Your Lovin', the '89 mix that they redid, which initially appeared on Ready and Willing or earlier in the catalog. But, I mean, Whitesnake's one of those bands that, I mean, David Coverdale, his voice is great, and I will pretty much at least give everything he does a chance. But, I mean, having Sykes in the band definitely elevated him to another level. So, and when he wasn't there anymore, it wasn't quite the same for me.
Tom?
You guys are probably going to hate me, but here's the deal. And this is what makes our shows popular, because we're different, right? So I used to date a girl who was really into Great White, and she was into Whitesnake, and that's all she would listen to all the time. And we had a really, really bad breakup. And because of that, I have a severe distaste for both of those bands. That's just the God's honest truth.
Did you have tickets for the show or something?
I told you so. I did tell you this story, didn't I?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was an Aerosmith show that she stole the tickets from me.
Oh.
But we're not going to get into the story of the ex-girlfriend. Her name was Sue. And Sue, if you're out there, I'm still mad at you. Okay. Seriously, it's weird because we talk about music as this is all kidding aside. Music does become the soundtrack of our lives, and we associate songs with periods of our life, and that can be both good and bad.
Yeah.
And this is just a band that I really associate with a really horrible human being that I don't ever like to think about. There's another girl I dated who was pretty awful, and she was really into Steve Winwood. And I still love Steve Winwood, though, because I liked Steve Winwood before I liked her, but I didn't really know Great White and Whitesnake before I dated this girl, and she ruined it for me.
Well,
that's it.
You need to go back through the Whitesnake catalog and at least give David Coverdale the benefit of the doubt here, for sure.
I need therapy is what I need. I need actual therapy to get past the demons in my life so that I can go back and listen to Whitesnake and Great White. And trust me, she liked Great White a lot more than she liked Whitesnake. And wow. I mean, I can't even hear the name Great White or say it without being traumatized. Have you ever had an experience like that, David, with a band?
No.
Okay, good.
All right, but Dave's gonna throw out our next album here. Let's see what he throws out here.
Yeah, another one that might be a little different. I'm gonna throw out Creed, Weathered from 2001. I mean, Creed's one of those bands that came in at the later end of the '90s, and I mean, they were like one of the last like mainstream rock bands that really sold a ton of albums. I mean, like Human Clay from '99 goes 11 times platinum, which is just crazy to think about. I mean, based off of the singles of like What If and Higher and With Arms Wide Open, obviously those songs were all over the radio back then. But then, I mean, they wait 2 years to follow up with Weathered, and in that time, the bass player leaves, and Scott Stapp's addiction and just mental illness starts to take hold a little bit, and things start to unravel. Just the Creed became so big so fast that he wasn't able to deal with it. And I mean, I for what Weathered in particular, I think it's an album that starts out pretty strong. It's arguably their heaviest record sonically. They were trying to be more aggressive, and I mean, it was the last album they would make for 8 years until 2009, because they broke up for a long time, and Scott Stapp went solo. He went to rehab, and then the rest of the guys are obviously in Alter Bridge now, which I feel like Creed was one of those bands that were ravaged by the critics back then, but the audiences loved them. But I think the negative opinions of Creed they always seem to be attached to Scott Stapp and not the other three guys. So I think he kind of brought on a lot of the negative attention because of his drug addictions and his antics, and he had kind of that messiah complex about his lyrics and his singing style sometimes kind of turned people off. And I mean, he had obviously a serious mental breakdown even within the last like 8 or 9 years, and he's since recovered from that. I've interviewed him a couple times, and he's always a great discussion because he's very open about his struggles and his recovery and everything. And but I mean, the 3 albums they released from 97 to 2001, I think, like My Own Prison from 97, I think is a pretty strong debut record. I mean, it's for the late 90s period where rock music was pretty much dominated by the post-grunge. I think that's one of the better releases to come out of the mainstream at that time. And then, I mean, the big songs off of Weathered were like One Last Breath, My Sacrifice, and Bullets. I mean, it still sold 6 million records, but I think by that point, the band was just out of gas. And then obviously they went on an extended hiatus. So, and then the album they came back with in 2009 didn't really do much of anything, and they haven't made anything since. So, yeah, I don't know what you guys think about it or if you listened to it in a while, but yeah,
I'm betting Tom's probably not a Creed guy.
Well, you would be wrong.
Really?
Yeah, I really like Creed a lot, actually.
Nice. All right, guys. The way you were looking there,
I always thought I was the only one, but
no, they are. I agree with you. They were. It's Nickelback is another band that gets a lot of grief. I'm not a Nickelback fan, but I'm not a Nickelback hater. Like I think I'm very indifferent when it comes to Nickelback, but I've always really liked Creed, and but you see, I didn't really follow a lot of that backstory. Because I wasn't really reading the press about, Scott Stapp or any of the other stuff. But like the song My Sacrifice, when right after that came out, I used to open with that on my acoustic sets. I used to do some acoustic happy hours, and I used to play an acoustic version of that to open up the evening, and it always went over really well. I just think that's a wonderful song. And I think Scott he's a great singer. And in terms of, like you said, I guess you would say that they fall into the post-grunge category. Of those bands. I mean, I think like Collective Soul and Creed were some of the bands that were technically not in my era. I was a little bit too old for them, but I really appreciated the material that those guys put out. Now, the only reason I'm not more familiar with some of Creed stuff is because at some point I shifted back from CDs to vinyl records. So I listen to vinyl records so much more than I do CDs that a lot of the bands that are just CD era, like Creed, I don't listen to as much. But yeah, I have a great appreciation for them, and I don't know the full albums, but again, as you said, I think that there was some great songs, But a lot of it's weird. It's kind of like it's like with punk bands, and I think grunge went through sort of the same thing. There was this like, you can't sell records if you're a punk band. You can't sell records if you're a grunge band. You can't be commercial. You can't do that. I mean, but that kind of narrative just doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And we know too that, even if an artist struggles with drug addiction and all those kinds of stuff, and then on some level they're an asshole or whatever, that doesn't necessarily take away from the quality of the music. And in some ways that can make them a better artist because they're passionate, and that craziness can actually help, or the tension between band members can create some good stuff. So great choice, by the way.
All right. Yeah. So my take on this album, I would say it's a good follow-up. Definitely, it did well, considering that the previous album was the one that really was real big. But this one definitely stands on its own. Had the other album not existed, this album would have definitely still kept them going and probably would have been their most successful album then. So this is definitely a very good album. Thumbs up. All right. So Tom, you're up.
All right. So we're going to go with, of course, one of the biggest, is that such a word? Yeah, I guess biggest selling records of all time by a band. It was their 11th, I believe. Yeah, it was their 11th studio record, and it was by far their biggest. They'd had many lineup changes. Any guesses?
Their 11th album, and it was their many lineup changes.
Yes. By this point, there was almost like 3 distinct groups. The only thing that stayed constant throughout their career was the rhythm section. And in fact, the band was named after the rhythm section. Oh, there's people screaming at the screen right now. Come on. David, no idea? Band named after the rhythm section. I can't even think of any other band named after the rhythm section. John and Mick. No, John. Yeah, John and Mick. Mick Fleetwood, John McVie,
Oh, yeah.
Fleetwood Mac. Come on, guys. Come on. You're killing me.
Yeah.
So, of course, the record that we're talking about for Fleetwood Mac is, of course, Penguin. No, I'm just kidding. It's it is Rumors. And Rumors was this Rumors. See, it did. Rumors is an album that gets even kids like to talk about it. But is that a kid?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Just making sure.
Yep.
So anyhow, Rumors, I mean, just a huge record. It was one of those records that just, again, the creative tensions, but it was truly a band effort. Everybody contributed to it. But man, the pressure to follow up on this record took a huge toll. And the follow-up was an incredibly ambitious 2-record set. Does anyone remember what it was called?
Tusk.
So, my opinion on this one is, I'm not a huge fan of this record, but I don't hate it. So in terms of, if it's another one of those records, I think, where Fleetwood Mac definitely tried to move away from a lot of the formula that had worked on their previous album. And from everything that I've read and in reading it and then listening back to the record, it makes sense that this was very much a Lindsay driven project. It's almost like, I mean, it's a shame. I almost could have done, like Pink Floyd, where you think about Pink Floyd, The Wall, and then the follow-up being the final cut and whatnot, where, one member just seems to kind of take over, even though the thing that made them great was the group effort. I think in Pink Floyd's case, it would be more like Dark Side of the Moon was truly a group effort. And then later on by final cut, it's all Roger. And the band kind of suffered from it. And I think Tusk suffers from the fact that it's a little too much Lindsay and not enough of the band dynamic. In terms of creativity, I think Tusk is is more creative than Rumors, but I think Rumors, again, is one of those records that just, I don't know, there's something about it, beginning to end. It's sold mega millions because, for good reason. And I think Tusk it kind of pales by comparison.
Yeah, it's looking at this from this perspective. It actually has my favorite Fleetwood Mac song on it, believe it or not, and that's "Think About Me." I just love that song. But overall, the album was deemed a failure, and that's what the record company felt, and also Mick Fleetwood blamed the album's failure on RKO radio chain playing the album in its entirety prior to its release, which allowed for mass home recording. But I think it was a high list price of the double album. It was a lot higher than a regular single album. You know how a lot of times back then, most double albums weren't like double the cost. It was just more like maybe a $4 add-on or something like that. But this one was like double the price, which made it, a lot harder for people to afford to buy it. Who's going to pay that much for a double album when you can get two other albums for the same price at that point? You got to remember, we're still in we had a lot of things going on there late in the 70s there. That was around the time of all the high gas prices and everything was getting out of hand with all that. So there was a lot that contributed, but overall, if the material was any really, really good, it would have sold better and people
Yep.
would have gave it better reviews. But that's the problem here. It really wasn't that good. And that was a big letdown.
Yeah, letdown is a good word. I agree.
Anything to add, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I give them credit for the attempt to like trying to do something artistic like that. I think they garnered so much goodwill from rumors that the record company was able to just give them a budget to try and kind of just indulge themselves on the next album. So it's definitely bloated, but there's some decent material there, but it's definitely not on the level of the two previous records. I mean, when I saw Lindsey Buckingham at the Riviera Theater in 2018, he did I think, yeah, he did a version of the title track "Tusk" with his solo band. And I thought that was pretty good, but nothing else from the album made it into the set. So,
yeah,
all right,
yeah, that's a great point. I forgot. I mean, they did. That was one of the things too, and that's interesting. When we talk about follow-ups to big records, is that the end result could be where the record label basically says, "Oh, you made this big record. Here's all the money you want to make the follow-up," and if you're young artists, which at the time they were relatively young, and you just hand them a bunch of money to go into the recording studio, hey, have at it. Yeah, I mean, either brilliant stuff is going to come out, or like you said, it's just going to be bloated, overindulgent. And again, this isn't a wretched record, but it's certainly, yeah. I mean, in terms of living up to the reputation that they had built up with Rumors, and even the record before Rumors was really solid too. This was kind of a dud.
Yep. All right, so I'm on my fourth, and then we'll have to breeze through here. We're getting to the bottom here. So my fourth one I'm throwing out is an album that went lost my place here, 8 times platinum, and this follow-up did go 2 times platinum, but it was definitely not revered well by critics. It was definitely not a big letdown compared to the previous album. The 1973 release of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was the mega album, and the 1974 follow-up Caribou just was not up to par in my estimation. We're going to give Elton a big thumbs down here. Just not a good album. Had a couple songs that got some airplay, but nothing more than that. It was just disaster, even with the cover itself. I mean, if you look at that cover, what a joke. You guys can comment, go ahead on that one, Dave.
Yeah, I have to definitely agree that it's a dud. I mean, it's for Elton John. I mean, those first 6 albums he released were just genius, like one of the great 6 album runs of anybody from that era. But yeah, he definitely. I mean, the way Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was structured, I mean, following up that is just tough. So, I mean, he rebounded after Caribou, but that was definitely a misstep.
Tom?
Well, it's kind of goes back to the discussion we were having about a double album. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. It's a great album. Like it's a double album, but man, that's a great double album. And I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting. And he did manage to, it really didn't affect him, but yeah, this is a horrible follow-up to what is a great record, but man, Goodbye. I can't get my mind off of just thinking of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and just how phenomenal that record is in terms of anything that he did before or afterwards. But I mean, if I remember correctly, he laid a couple of duds in his career, but
But this was
it's
the first.
Yeah. Just I don't know. I mean, what was the time frame between the two records?
Less than a year.
Less than a year. Yeah. I mean, that's again, that's a situation where maybe you're just trying to capitalize on. I mean, he put, but I mean, the early part of his career, he was really putting out a lot of music quickly, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So I don't know. Hey, you miss every shot you don't take.
Yeah.
But you don't,
All right.
you don't make every shot that you do, right?
All right. So let's give us your final throw out here, Dave. Who do you got? The cat.
Yeah. I think she'd been waiting to jump on the desk the whole time. So, all right. Yeah. My final one is Black Sabbath, Master of Reality. I mean,
Ooh.
the follow-up to Paranoid, which went 4 times platinum in 1970. I mean, this one comes out in 71. It goes platinum, but I mean, other than like, I mean, I'm a big Sabbath fan. They're one of my favorite bands of all time, so I hold this record in high regard. But I think other than Sweet Leaf and Children of the Grave, you really don't hear anything else on the radio ever. It's not really a commercial record. There's not anything that, I mean, it's commonly cited as kind of giving birth to the whole stoner metal genre, with like just After Forever and Orchid and Into the Void and stuff like that. So I mean, I think the influence on some of the later metal bands is bigger than the commercial or critical success of the album. So in that sense, I guess it was a success.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a solid choice. I think it's I think it's a fair follow-up. Definitely could have been better, but it's not a bad follow-up like that previous one I mentioned with the Elton John. So, I'll give Sabbath, semi thumbs up there. What about you, Tom?
Yeah, I don't think they really laid an egg until that last one with Ozzy. Was it Never Say Die? Was that
Yeah.
the one?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of a dud, but yeah, I think in terms of Master Reality, I mean, it hasn't been too long since I've listened to this one. And I mean, this is the follow-up to Paranoid, right? Because I didn't hear the beginning,
Yeah.
but Paranoid's a very special record. I mean, that's just, man, and that record has held up so well. I think Master of Reality was a great record for its time. I don't think it held up as well as Paranoid, but I as a record collector, I have, that's one of the ones where there was a poster in it that's highly sought after, and I have the poster, so with the record. So anybody out there, make me an offer.
All right. Well, we're gonna make you throw out your final selection. Here's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, David always makes me jealous because he clearly has his records better organized than I do, because he just breaks them out at will. And I never think to lay mine out before we do this.
I usually start prepping the day before. So.
Okay, because I just happen to have this one pretty close by. So this is the one. This is the big record. Can you see this?
Oh yeah.
So that's the Moving Pictures box set.
Yeah.
Which
the new one.
Oh my God!
Just came out last year.
Can we just go off on a buddy trail? There is a live record in here from the Moving Pictures tour. It's the entire concert, beginning to end. Oh my God, you got to hear it. CD, vinyl, whatever. It's so good.
Yep.
And Moving Pictures as a studio album. Wow. I mean, the production qualities, the quality of the material. I mean, dang, they hit it. So the follow-up, of course, is Signals. And Signals marked, they had slowly but surely, like we just did a Queen ranking show not too long ago. And one of the things that we mentioned about Queen is that Queen eventually started to integrate synthesizers into the music. Van Halen's another one I never really thought about, how as they evolved, they incorporated more, synthesizers and things like that. And so Signals to me was that hard move towards synthesizers. And I had a real hard time with it when I first heard it. But I've learned to really like and appreciate the record. I think it's a very good to excellent record. And really what I admire most about Rush is they were always a band that was willing to grow and not get stuck in a rut. Like they were willing to take chances and do some things. And that's what made Rush. Right. So in terms of commercial appeal and whatnot, I think that, I think ultimately Rush, instead of becoming a very like poppy, trendy band, they became a band that had a very loyal fan base that was willing to follow along with what they did. And in that respect, I think Signals was kind of the beginning of that phase. So maybe from a commercial standpoint, not a huge success in terms of a follow-up, but in terms of laying the groundwork for the latter part of their career, yeah, I'll give them that.
Yeah, it was a good bridge to get to the next, coming out of the 80s or start, from this end of the 70s, you come out with Moving Pictures, before that was Permanent Waves, and then you transform into Signals. That's the beginning of the transformation, and I think Peart's lyrics got deeper, more meaningful, and this is the album that kind of started it off. And classic example is Subdivisions, what a great lyrical song. I just we did Rush. We ranked them right in the beginning because that was one of our favorites right off the bat. Me and you did them. We knew it was it was going to be a great one to rank. And man, I was actually just listening to these guys yesterday, and trying to think what song was it that popped on from this album. As a matter of fact, it was just great hearing it. Digital Man. Woo. Man,
okay.
was that sounded just amazing. I'm thinking here going, wow. Just a great album overall. I mean, I didn't, it's not moving pictures, but it's definitely, in my opinion, my estimation, a very solid follow-up. So what do you got?
I think they were one of those bands. Sorry to interrupt, Dave, but
No.
they were one of those bands that were smart enough not to get pigeonholed. Like, all these, we've had this discussion so many times about, Nirvana and destroying all these classic rock artists in the 90s. And they didn't destroy Rush. I mean, Rush just kept the course. They stayed true to themselves. They continued to evolve. They catered to their fan base. They didn't worry about, the charts or any of that stuff. And I give them credit. I mean, I think that's a smarter way to do it than just trying to, make Bat Out of Hell 3 and 4. It's not always the way to do it.
Yep. Let's hear what Dave says about it.
Yeah, I like Signals a lot. I mean, Rush is one of my favorite bands. I mean, the thing about them is they never really, at least to me, it never felt like they ever phoned anything in. It was always like they gave 100% effort to whatever, like stylistically, they were pursuing at that time. And I mean, The Analog Kid is always one of my favorite tracks off the album. Mm-hmm. So it's one you don't hear too often anymore. But yeah, I mean, for their 80s output, I think it's definitely one of the stronger albums.
Yeah, they definitely never made the same record twice, for sure, ever.
No. Definitely underrated album, I feel. As time goes on, I think more people appreciate Signals even more than they did when they first heard it. Definitely, for sure. All right, so we're going to bring this thing to a close now. And I got the album of all albums to end it on here.
Wait, drum roll.
So this album was humongous. And this goes back to 1983. And it went 8 times platinum. And the follow-up, I don't know. There never was a follow-up to it. We're talking about Synchronicity.
Oh, my Lord. That's hilarious.
I figure it's a good way to end it here.
That is hilarious.
I mean, they just felt that Synchronicity was never going to be beaten, so they decided never to make another album. I don't know. But wait, obviously...
You really think that was a they? Or him?
But yeah, definitely. I thought about it. I said, that's how come they never made the follow-up? As big as this album was, their biggest album of their career, they left it on a high note and just ran off into the sunset. It's like not too many bands ever do that.
There's one song on there, and I can't remember the name of it, that's just atrocious, though. Like, the whole rest of the album is perfect, but there's just one song I remember that's really bad. Do you guys know the one I'm talking about?
Not really.
Man, somebody out there's got to know it.
Murder by Numbers?
No, that's a great song. Every
Sahara?
song on the record is great except for one, and the one song is like as bad as the other songs are great. That's what I remember about this record.
Miss Gradenko?
Maybe that's it. Yeah,
the 2-minute song that Stuart Copeland wrote.
Yeah, it's got to be it. I mean, if Stuart Copeland wrote it.
Wow. Well, he crossed him off your interview list. Yeah, he won't do an interview with you.
He ain't Stuart Copeland ain't gonna watch this.
Hey, you never know. We'll flag it and tag it for police. Maybe he'll come on over for it.
Dude, he's an amazing drummer. I mean, he's actually he's just did an interview with a friend of mine because he's coming to Rochester with the Philharmonic Orchestra. But yeah, Yeah, that's an interesting choice though. I mean, what do you do with them? I suppose you could almost say that Sting's follow-up was whatever, after Synchronicity, but Andy Summers has actually put out some really interesting instrumental solo records that I really enjoy. And Sting to me has always been very hit and miss, but in terms of the Police, yeah, you're right. I mean, this record is, oh wow. Before we came on, I was actually just listening to the Police Live Synchronicity tour. It was a Record Store Day release. So that recording is just, I mean, they were so good on that tour. Those live recordings from that tour, they're just phenomenal. It's hard to believe that you just can't get past your own egos just to do something. I mean, and that reunion tour they did, the recordings from that, I mean, they just sound lifeless. They just sound like they just couldn't. I don't think it was that they phoned in. I think they were just kind of over it. They just were like, they didn't have the energy or the passion anymore. I mean, they played with a lot of like if you listen to really early Police recordings, they sound very punk and very energetic, and they're great. And then by the end, they become, they got the reggae influences and everything. They're very polished, and Synchronicity is such a strong record. And the concerts from that area are very strong. But then they did the reunion tour, I don't know how many years later, and it just sounded, like they were just dragging.
All right. Well, this was a great episode.
Well, we
here.
didn't get Dave's take because I stepped all over it. So Dave, that's on you.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Police for me, they were always one of those bands that, I mean, they only made 5 albums, but I feel like they didn't stick around long enough to make anything truly terrible. So I mean, all 5 of those records are pretty tight. So I mean, I saw Stuart Copeland at Kleinhans in 2021 when he played with the BPO, and he kind of reworked a lot of those Police songs to fit the orchestra context, and it was pretty cool. So
yeah.
Right. Well, that puts a wrap on this episode. We're going to come up with some more good, interesting ideas, and we'll bring those up in a future time frame here. But great having you guys on here as always, and great to discuss music. And stay tuned. We've definitely got a lot more stuff hopefully coming down the road here.